We're now coming to the Elizabethan and Jacobean age, that is, the reign of Queen Elizabeth and the reign of her successor, James I. James in Latin is Jacobus, so that gives you the adjective Jacobean. Elizabeth I reigned from 1558 to 1603, but in the field of literature, the period extending until the death of her successor, James I, forms a larger age. The two reigns are different, but together they form a long and unique moment in the history of culture, when the English language not only became truly modern English, but found in written productions an acme of possibilities. Great, powerful art, relevant not only to England, but to the whole of Western civilization. In fairness, greater English poets, playwrights, essayists, and thinkers had not existed before. They now flourished to develop the last fruits of the Renaissance as it morphed into Baroque modernism and the early shapes of modern times, and they gave to the whole of Europe some of the best art production, some of the best literature ever written. Now we should start with prose. So far we have dealt a lot with poetry, and I have ended up my previous lecture with the rise of drama, a sort of preparatory stage to what we're going to study today, which is really the acme of the English stage. But first, prose. Prose became an autonomous branch of literature. So far we have dealt with prose in terms of chronicles. You remember the Venerable Bede, mainly focused on recording things. Now with the Elizabethan era, prose really became independent. First with the essay tradition, one of the most important cultural traditions of the whole Anglo-Saxon world. It probably began with the success, European-wide success, of Michel de Montaigne's first collection of essays. Now, this short didactic prose form is intended to argue one's personal ideas to a lay audience. It was soon picked up in England, where it grounded a fundamental tradition in English criticism and philosophy. It's still there in modern education and even in journalism. In France, for instance, the school system is truly focused on, more or less still today, dissertation. While in England, in the United States, all over the English-speaking world, it's still the essay, not the dissertation. The Elizabethan and Jacobean age immediately took the genre to perfection, with great authors from John Lilly to Francis Bacon, and their productions and reflections influenced many other literary forms. So let's start with John Lilly, the father of, that's a tongue twister, euphuism. That's from Greek, euphuis, well-spoken, well-mannered, well-natured. There was very soon an ism attached to it, because the character in his two, let's not call them novels, romances, Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit, and then Euphues and His England, became a sort of model for a style of writing that was recommended, advocated by John Lilly. On the left here you have the title page of the first edition. Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit. Very pleasant for all gentlemen to read, and most necessary to remember, wherein are contained the delights that wit followeth in his youth, by the pleasantness of love, and the happiness he reapeth in age, blah, 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 etc. Okay, well, they're not really novels, they're not really romances, though in fact it's about this character, Euphues, and what happens to him and what he says. But in fact, these are a collection of essays. And the key idea is that they advocate super refined, ornate language in prose to permanently demonstrate wit. Wit is one of the key Elizabethan ideals. So what is wit? Now, if you take a look at the footnote here I have provided, it's much more than simply le bel esprit, as you would say in French. It starts with really a man's ability for knowledge and consciousness, the five wits, les cinq sens, to have one's wits about. But here's the OED definition. Good or great mental capacity, intellectual ability, genius, talent, cleverness, mental quickness or sharpness, acumen, quickness of intellect or liveliness of fancy, with capacity of apt expression, etc., etc. Well, you see, it's everything together, the best of intelligence and elegance. By extension, you even had a noun created, a wit. You could be a wit. A university wit was therefore a young man with a university education, having conferred to him this precious Elizabethan quality of elegance, intelligence, conscious use of language. That is the key idea. A sine qua non condition for writing under Elizabeth and James. Using the language consciously, with a clear conscience of its power. I'll give you a short example. Nowadays, of course, we would find this rather overblown and ridiculous. But what is important to understand is the striving. For this generation, it was all new. Now, today we find use of tropes and conceits, figures of speech, and long conceptual metaphors. We find this to be too much. But for them, it was all new, and they reveled in it. So here's a short example from Euphues, or the Anatomy of Wit, in which Euphues, our hero, tells a friend that he should not actually weep for the death of his daughter. And you will see the whole text is based on repetitive antitheses, figures of speech, parallels, far too much actually. Thou weepest for the death of thy daughter, and I laugh at the folly of the father. For greater vanity is there in the mind of the mourner than bitterness in the death of the deceased. See, it's even musical. But she was amiable, but yet sinful. But she was young, and might have lived, but she was mortal, and must have died. Ay, but her youth made thee often merry. Ay, but thine age should once makes thee wise. Ay, but her green years were unfit for death. Ay, but thy hoary hairs should despise life. Knowest thou not, Eubulus, that life is the gift of God, death the due of nature? You see, it's permanently rhetorical all the time. Okay, for us, perhaps a bit silly, for them, absolutely essential. However, you must not imagine that late Tudor England was a place where one could publish and circulate one's ideas at will via essays. Far from it. Be it under Edward VI, after Henry VIII, or Queen Mary, when the old faith, that's Catholicism, returned with a vengeance, let alone under Elizabeth, who really created the equivalent of a modern police state, with, informers spying on everything. The religious divide, related threats from Spain, Irish rebellions, and multiple plots made sure everybody had to be cautious. Printing had developed, but books had to be registered ahead of publication, and the monarch's Privy Council could always intervene, ban, prosecute, and imprison. Legally, everyone had to take the oath of supremacy, that is, acknowledging the monarch's sole ecclesiastical authority as the head of the Church of England. Everybody had to attend the Church of England services once a week, believing in the 39 articles and using only the Book of Common Prayer. People also had to pay tithes, la dîme. If you did not do those things, you were a dissenter, and you were barred from many things. Exercising public office, but you could also, for instance, you could also be fined. You could have your property seized, or worse, for instance, if you dare to harbor a Jesuit in your attic, really nasty things could ensue. So the Elizabethan age is a great age of expansion of the mind, but not necessarily with absolute freedom to say what you like. And maybe this constraint contributed to the intelligence. As I said, conscious use of language, where sometimes double entendre, not necessarily the bawdy kind, is implicit. So when you study an Elizabethan text, you always have to go between the lines. There's always more than meets the eye in the printed words. This atmosphere of repression is perhaps why it was necessary to write your essays on apparently innocuous topics in order to develop your ideas. It was also perhaps advisable to use imaginary names in far-flung settings. And this is exactly what you find with novels. I'm using inverted commas because they are not really real romans, not really real modern novels. A classic case is Thomas Nash and his Unfortunate Traveller. You might say this is the first English novel, but not really. It's safely set in the past under Henry VIII, and it's full of low-life characters, the picaros of the Spanish tradition, and romantic lovers. So if you read it without paying too much attention, you find it, as I said, completely innocuous. But if you read between the lines, you will find social criticism. You will find political hints. Nash, by the way, also wrote pamphlets. Now, the pamphlets, which is another branch of the prose tradition now developing, were mostly illicit or semi-illicit, and they were really direct in what they had to say. Of course, they were mostly anonymous. Even people with a certain status, with protection, like the poet Sir Philip Sidney, who we are going to study later on, when he published the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia in 1593, had to use an innocuous setting in order to pass on messages. On the face of it, it's a pastoral story of shepherd and shepherdesses in a green Edenic setting, and this is supposed to be something offered to his sister, the Countess of Pembroke, but in fact, there's a message in it. Likewise, Elizabethans were very fond of compilations of anecdotes and legends. They often translated it from the French or the Italian. Classic example is Belfort's Histoire Tragique, one of the sources for Shakespeare's Hamlet. That could also do the trick. It's entertaining in all directions, but there is more than entertainment if you read, again, between the lines. So we have the word novel. We have people you may call novelists, but it's not yet the roman. It's interesting to notice the word comes from Italian novella. Basically, novella means news. So short story bringing new, entertaining stuff. That's the original concept. So you see, literary borders were very much blurred. On the face of it, you may say the Euphues books are novels, but they're really not, they're essays. In the same manner, you may say Thomas Nash wrote novels, but they're not really novels. The Countess of Arcadia Pembroke's Arcadia is supposed to be a pastoral, but it's more than a pastoral. Now, I must mention at the other end of the period, the second greatest essay writer of the Elizabethan and Jacobean age, Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam. Now he too used those devices to conceal his ideas. For instance, he used the New World in his New Atlantis. He tells you a story of people navigating on the Atlantic Ocean and discovering a new country. Well, that should remind you of Sir Thomas More's Utopia. Likewise, when he wrote philosophy, he often did it in Latin. His Novum Organum Scientiarum was safely published in Latin first. But in his essays, he is fairly frank. Now, these essays are masterpieces of the genre. They are masterpieces of the English language at large. I'm going to give you a short example here with maybe for students you'd be interested in the second one of studies, but I think the first one, the short one of adversity, is really revealing. So you see, it's much shorter than what you would expect from a modern essay, but it contains everything in a nutshell. So let's read it. Of adversity. The virtue of prosperity is temperance. The virtue of adversity is fortitude, which in morals is the more heroical virtue. Prosperity is the blessing of the Old Testament. Adversity is the blessing of the New, which carrieth the greater benediction and the clearer revelation of God's favour. So it starts with those rhetorical tropes, and you can see obviously the swaying between the two segments of the sentence working in parallel. It starts in a fairly orthodox way, saying that the New Testament, of course, is superior to the Old Testament, Christianity having better revelation than, traditional Judaism. Okay, that's a classic thing. But then he immediately starts to warp things slightly. Yet even in the Old Testament, if you listen to David's harp, you shall hear as many hearse-like airs as carols. David's harp, of course, this is alluding to King David's songs, the Psalms, and he says in them you hear as many hearse-like airs as carols, autant de chansons funèbres que de chansons joyeuses. And the pencil of the Holy Ghost hath laboured more in describing the afflictions of Job than the felicity of Solomon. So you see, somehow, very slyly, he's telling you that after all, maybe the Old Testament is just as wise, and maybe the Holy Ghost, who is supposed to be the author of the Bible, has given more attention, paid more attention to the Old Testament, and paid more attention to suffering than to felicity. So maybe after all, the Old Testament is not as inferior to the New, and that's not an orthodox religious view. Prosperity is not without many fears and distastes, and adversity is not without comforts and hopes. Okay, very standard. And now he's going to end the essay with a pile-up of metaphors. You will have needlework and embroidery, the heart and the eye, and then precious odours. We see in little works and embroideries, it is more pleasing to have a lively work upon a sad and solemn ground, than to have a dark and melancholy work upon a lightsome ground. See, it's more pleasant to embroider with light-coloured thread on a dark background than to embroider with a dark thread on a light, clear background. Interesting. Black and white. What is hidden? What is shown? Judge, therefore, of the pleasure of the heart by the pleasure of the eye. Light and shadow. In your eye, versus what is in your heart, what is deep versus what is superficial. And yet, isn't the eye supposed to be more superficial than the heart? And here he seems to recommend appearance because it's the eye that tells you that it's more pleasant to have a dark background in embroidery than a light-colored background. Aha. Certainly virtue is like precious odors, most fragrant when they are incensed or crushed. For prosperity doth best discover vice, but adversity doth best discover virtue. So you see the echo again? Discover what is hidden, what is shown. And another metaphor, precious odors being crushed, or incense. It's true, with many sweet-smelling material, you have to burn it or crush it in order for the odor, the pleasant smell, to come out. And of course, this could be read as repression, helping somehow the truth, the sweet-smelling odor to come out. So you see, this can be read on many, many different levels. When you're dealing with Sir Francis Bacon, you're really giving caviar to your mind. You really have to read it several times to understand what he could possibly mean. It can go in one direction or in another direction. It's not absolutely clear. On the surface, it's supposed to be a very simple moral view that, adversity is good because it ultimately reveals your ability to reach virtue through ordeals. But it can also be read here as a message of fighting repression, of hiding things in order for them to be later revealed. There could be an occult side to the meaning. This, of course, will bring me to my final consideration on this age of prose, and that would be to underline it to you that we must not understand this Elizabethan and Jacobean age as an age of reason. Of course, people like Bacon were indeed philosophers, definitely. Bacon is a philosopher, and of course he is one of the great pioneers of modern science, you might say. But this age was not characterized by a total separation between types of knowledge. On the contrary, there was no separation. Bacon himself was interested in the occult, very much. Elizabeth was often asking her personal astrologer and seer, John Dee, for horoscopes. James I fancied himself as an expert on witches. He even published a treatise on demonology. Even when Nash published a book in which he attempted to rationalize ghost stories, the readers bought it for the enjoyment of the stories themselves and really did not buy the rationality of it. To give you an example of how far it went, John Dee and his medium, Edward Kelly, ended up at the court of the Holy German Emperor Rudolf II in Prague, where they joined some real scientists like Tycho Brahe and Kepler, really founding fathers of modern astronomy. But these men were also interested in alchemy. And these were the days when Rabelais' Gollum was supposed to be roaming the streets of Prague. It's all the same period. In those days, alchemy and chemistry, zoology and the study of monsters, astronomy and astrology were not separated yet. Last name I have to mention, Robert Burton. He is famous for The Anatomy of Melancholy. It's a text, you see the two words. Anatomy sounds like science, but you wouldn't apply that nowadays to a state of mind like melancholy. So it oscillates between a medical textbook and something much more like a philosophy treatise. There is in Elizabethan prose this permanent alternation between rationality, clearness of views, and at the same time the sort of interest for the occult, the double meaning, the between the lines. Oh, and don't forget, the chronicles went on. We have a great chronicler with Raphael Holinshed who was one of the major sources for Shakespeare. So much for English Elizabethan and Jacobean prose.